Can you guys hear me okay through the mask? All right. Good? Okay. All right. Well, hello, everybody. I am Kelly Kepsel. I work in the marketing department here at DSU, but I am representing the EDI committee, so I do want to welcome everybody today. I have a couple of housekeeping items. If there are any students online listening right now, please make sure that you email edi@dsu.edu so that they know you attended. They want to send you a survey after this. And then President Griffiths asked us to share this with you. In honor of the centennial of women gaining the right to vote, Governor Kristi Noem commissioned the Her Vote, Her Voice Women's Vote Centennial Delegation. This group works with the South Dakota State Historical Society and the Historical Foundation to celebrate past successes while striving toward future goals. President Griffiths is a member of this delegation, and she wanted us to let you know about a video created by Her Vote, Her Voice, which highlights the history of the suffrage movement in South Dakota and efforts to preserve and elevate women's history in our state. And the video, hervotehervoice.org/live. And for those of you here, I did write it up here. It took me a while to find a marker that would write, but I did it. So I'm going to get you some new ones, Dale. But I am really pleased to welcome Cecilia Whitmire tonight. She has a master's degree in mass communications from South Dakota State University in Brookings and a doctoral degree in marketing from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. She was hired as the assistant professor of marketing at DSU in fall 1986. In 1998, she was named acting vice president of academic affairs while the university conducted a national search for that position. In 1999, she was named to the position and remained there until she retired from DSU in 2013. Her presentation tonight is based on research from her master's thesis, Newspaper Coverage of the Women's Suffrage Movement in South Dakota at the Time of Statehood. Her doctoral dissertation focuses on anticipatory socialization and has always gotten far less attention than her master's thesis.
Okay, how's that? Good. It is true that my master's thesis has always gotten much more attention than my doctoral dissertation. And it's kind of nice to be relevant every 25 years or so. You know, another celebration comes up, another deadline, 75 years, 100 years, bicentennial, whatever it was. And so every couple of 20-ish years or so, I kind of dust off my master's thesis and talk to groups again. So anyway, thank you so much for having me here tonight. We're here tonight to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the women's suffrage movement, both nationally and in South Dakota. I'm assuming most of you voted in the primaries and intend to vote again in November. If you're here tonight, you got 2 stamps to use on your mail-in ballot if that's what you're going to do. But when you vote, you have a cadre of very brave women to thank for that privilege. They were threatened, they were arrested, they were humiliated, they were beaten. But in today's vernacular, nonetheless, they persisted. So to that end, I'm going to talk to you tonight about one of the largest and eventually one of the most successful efforts of civil disobedience that occurred both in South Dakota and in this nation. As Kelly said, my master's thesis is on newspaper coverage of the suffrage movement in South Dakota at the time of statehood. I examined the coverage of 10 different newspapers in South Dakota. They had to have been published both during the first and during the last campaign of suffrage in South Dakota. So that covered a period from 1889 to 1918. And as a spoiler alert for all of you, if you probably may have already guessed this, South Dakota newspapers and newspaper editors were not crusaders for equality and for justice and for suffrage. So, except for him, that's right. So let me begin with the background on the national suffrage movement to give you kind of a perspective of what happened in South Dakota. The Seneca Falls Conference in Seneca Falls, New York, is considered the birthplace of the suffrage movement in the United States. On July 4th, 1848, a group of 300 people, including 40 men, held a conference to discuss the social, civil, and religious rights of women. Several years before, in 1840, the World Anti-Slavery Convention in London refused to seat women at the convention. And two of those women, Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, met each other again in Seneca Falls. They became friends, and they decided that they needed to organize their own convention to talk about the rights of women. At the conventions, Elizabeth Cady Stanton was asked to give the keynote address, and she read what she called her Declaration of Sentiments. It started on a familiar note with these words. She said, "In the course of human events," which sounds familiar to all of us. However, the tone and the content soon changed. Stanton went on to say, "This history of mankind is a history of repeated injuries on the part of men toward women, having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over her. To prove this, let facts be admitted to a candid world. He has never permitted her to exercise her inalienable rights to the elective franchise. He has compelled her to submit to laws, the formation of which she has no voice. He has withheld from her the rights which are given to the most ignorant and degraded of men, both natives and foreigners. He's deprived her of this first right of a citizen, the elective franchise, and as a consequence, he's left her without representation in the halls of legislation and has oppressed her on all sides." She concluded, after several more hours, I don't think it was quite that bad, she concluded by saying that married women were civilly dead. Single women were taxed without representation. They were deprived of the ballot, of rights of property, of rights to their persons, and of rights over their children. Women were deprived of educational and occupational opportunities, and they were subjected to a double standard of morality and to the assumption of the basic superiority of men. And, she said, women were cataloged in state constitutions with idiots, lunatics, criminals, and paupers. And, she said, this is going to have to change. As might be expected, the suffrage movement was opposed by big business, particularly the oil industry, the railroads, the liquor industry, and even religion. Any organization that was comfortable with the status quo and a male-dominated world was opposed to suffrage for women. Although the suffrage movement started in the East, it spread to with the pioneers to the western part of the U.S. In 1869, the Wyoming Territory was the first place in the U.S. to pass a suffrage movement or a suffrage measure. At first, the men saw it as a great way to get publicity in the eastern newspapers and to attract new settlers. However, officials there finally did stand firm in their commitment to suffrage, even when it threatened their petition for statehood. They announced, "We will remain out of the Union for 100 years rather than come in without the women," they told Congress, but eventually Congress relented and did admit them into statehood in 1890 with a suffrage plank in their Constitution. Eventually, the women stepped forward to form local, state, and national suffrage organizations, and they became the main force behind the national suffrage movement. In fact, many of the national suffrage leaders spent years of their life in South Dakota working to vote, most notably Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, and Matilda Joslyn Gage. Stanton, who was the primary author of the Declaration of Sentiments that was read at Seneca Falls, was one of the first women to express outrage that the 14th Amendment protecting the voting rights of male citizens. The 14th Amendment, in fact, is the first time that gender is ever mentioned in our Constitution. And she said, if that word male is inserted, it will take us at least a century to get it out. And she was close to being right. The 19th Amendment passed on July 9th, 1863, and it was one of the Reconstruction Amendments. Section 1 says that no state can deprive a person of life, liberty, or property without due process, nor can they deny any person equal protection under the law. Southern states were forced to ratify the 14th Amendment in order to regain representation in Congress. That was the trade-off. Section 1's equal protection under the law is the basis for landmark decisions like Brown versus the Board of Education on racial desegregation, Roe versus Wade on abortion, and Obergefell versus Hodges, which is same-sex marriage. Section 2 is the problem. It lays out how representatives will be apportioned to states based on the whole number of persons in the state, excluding Indians not taxed. And it also assigns voting rights to male inhabitants in the state, 21 years of age, and citizens of the US. So at first, that became a problem immediately. At first, national suffragists focused on meetings and speeches and petitions. When that didn't yield results, the suffragists took note of the actions of those people who were working in Britain on the suffrage movement there. While older members of the suffrage movement in the US continued to focus on meetings and speeches, the younger and newer members decided to try a more radical approach. They focused their efforts instead on marches and parades and picketing. In fact, many of the tools of protest that the activists use today were actually honed by the suffragists, from mass marches and picketing outside the White House to wearing badges and pins to express their support for a cause. In the later days of the suffrage campaign, there was a group called the Silent Sentinels, and in fact, if you saw the ad for this speech, there was kind of in the background, there was a group of women with picket signs, and those were the Silent Sentinels. They picketed the White House 6 days a week, forcing President Wilson to see their demands literally every time he walked out the window, or looked out the window, because they walked in front of the White House. Never said a word. In January 1918, 9 months before the end of World War I, the House of Representatives approved a suffrage amendment, and as it passed through the Senate, Wilson gave it his full support. He said, "We have made partners of the women in this war. Shall we admit them only to a partnership of suffering and sacrifice and toil, and not a partnership of privilege and right?" So even though the Senate rejected the amendment the next day, September 31st, it was eventually approved in June 1919. So now that you know the national movement, let's talk about South Dakota. As early as 1872, the Dakota Territory Legislature came within one vote of enfranchising women, but the chair of the Territorial Committee cast a no vote to break the tie. Although the Honorable G.C. Moody later became a champion of suffrage, his vote set the stage for one of the state's longest political struggles. In October 1885, the Dakota Territory residents attended a national suffrage meeting in Minneapolis. The first Dakota Territory Suffrage Club was organized shortly thereafter in Webster, and the organizer was Marietta Bones. That may be a South Dakota name that you're familiar with, those of you who are natives. After the convention, local leaders wrote to Susan B. Anthony, and they asked her to come to the state to help them campaign for suffrage. In 1886, the territorial legislature passed a suffrage plank, but the territorial governor, who was Governor Pierce of Chicago, vetoed it again. He thought that suffrage leadership should come from Congress and not from states, and certainly not from territories that wanted to become states. And so it was pushed aside again. When South Dakota became a state in 1889, the Constitution was accepted without suffrage for women, although it did give a vote to immigrants who had filed their first papers. Filing first papers meant that the immigrant was registered with the county and had declared that they intended to become a naturalized citizen. So they had gone in once, signed their first papers announcing that they intended to follow through. And when they did that, they gained the right to vote in South Dakota. The new Constitution did require the legislature to submit a suffrage amendment to the voters at the next full election. So in November 1889, at the first legislative session after statehood, the legislature discussed this requirement that had been part of the passage of the Constitution, and they disagreed about whether or not they needed to honor that commitment that the territorial legislature had made to the women of the state. Many of the legislators suggested that it really wasn't necessary to submit the suffrage plank to the voters of the state. Finally, however, the men yielded to pressure, and they agreed to put the suffrage plank on the 1890 ballot, although it was eventually badly defeated. In November 1889, which is about the time that the South Dakota legislature was arguing about whether or not they ought to submit this to the voters, Marietta Bones and some other state workers attended another national convention in Chicago. At the convention, the national officers of the WCTU, the Women's Christian Temperance Unit, and the two suffrage organizations, there were two national suffrage organizations by then, they clashed over the issues of temperance, politics, and suffrage. Marietta Bones of Webster took the side of Ellen Foster, who was an Iowa delegate, who said that the movement and the activities should be nonpartisan. However, Bones wanted suffrage and temperance to continue to work together. Susan B. Anthony got caught in the middle of this disagreement. Foster and Bones on one side and Frances Willard of the WCTU on the other side. Susan B. Anthony agreed that with Bones that the suffrage movement should be nonpartisan, but she disagreed with Frances Willard and said that it should be separate from temperance. This disagreement at the national level between suffrage and temperance eventually affected the suffrage campaigns in South Dakota. In 1890, South Dakota suffragists asked for financial support from the national organization. Remember that the suffrage amendment was going to be presented to the voters at the first South Dakota election, and the state suffrage workers wanted help promoting their campaign. So the national organization gave South Dakota $4,000, but they named Susan B. Anthony as the chair of the South Dakota campaign or committee, and they gave her control of the money. She, in turn, refused to pay for any suffrage activities that were linked with temperance, knowing that the cause was inheriting all of the enemies of prohibition, mainly the liquor industry. And that obviously was an organization that had very large purse strings. Susan B. Anthony's control of the purse strings only increased the tension between her and Marietta Bones, who was one of the original state organizers. In 1890, Bones accused Anthony of misappropriating thousands of dollars from the suffrage fund, and the fight made it into all of the area newspapers. So from the February 1890 issue of the Argus Leader, it said, the editor said, Susan B. Anthony and Mrs. Marietta Bones of South Dakota have each other by the ears. Mrs. Bones says that Susan is tricky and scheming, and Susan says that Mrs. Bones doesn't amount to much. In April 1890, the Argus Leader wrote, a few days ago, Miss Anthony thought she had clinched things by remarking that she was not a mean, measly, rotten apple because she was pelted by such. But Marietta Bones countered, oftentimes what appears to be a good, sound apple is rotten to the core. These two women, the editor said, are having more trouble with apples than their grandmother in the Garden of Eden. In June 1890, Aberdeen's Saturday Pioneer News wrote that South Dakota suffragists have no use whatsoever for Miss Bones and very little use for Miss Anthony. The sooner they are muzzled effectively, the better for all true friends of the cause. Mrs. Bones, in a clever letter to the Minneapolis Tribune last week, continues the old war against her enemy, Miss Anthony. Frankly, it would be better for the cause of women's suffrage if both of these women could be out of the state until after the election. In July, the Aberdeen Daily News wrote, the women suffragists of the state have kicked it up, if this is not a disrespectful thing to say of ladies. It's a big mess among them. A quarrel was precipitated that will not be healed. National suffrage leaders spend months campaigning, lecturing throughout the state in 1889 and 1890. But the campaign lacks organization and has never really recovered from the disagreements about money and mixing politics, suffrage, and temperance. So the newspapers knew this was not going well. That's maybe a fair statement. An incident late in October 1890 revealed just how discouraged the workers were. Anthony and Mary Seymour Howell of New York were riding in an old wagon across South Dakota, driven by what Susan B. Anthony later described as a prematurely old little boy, whose feet did not touch the wagon floor. The aged horses could not move faster than a walk, even though a cold Dakota wind was blowing into their faces. After an unbroken, silent hour, Susan B. Anthony turned to Mrs. Howell and said, Mrs. Howell, humanity is at a very low ebb. And by Election Day in November 1890, the campaign had disintegrated and the amendment was badly defeated. The women's efforts were summarized by Libby Wardall, who was the state suffrage organizers, their press secretary. And she reported in one of the history books that they gave 879 speeches by national speakers, 707 speakers by state speakers, 204 speeches given under the auspices of the WCTU, so a total then of 1,600 speeches given across the state. And remember, this is 1890. They had given 1,600 speeches. A total of 400 local and county clubs had been organized, and $8,000 had been spent. Nonetheless, despite their best efforts, the amendment was defeated. There were 68,600 votes that were cast in the 1890 election, and there were almost 23,000 votes for women's suffrage and 45,600 against, so nearly twice as many. Suffrage received about a third of the votes cast, so 1,600 speeches, $8,000 for fewer than 23,000 votes. In 1890, there were 30,000 immigrants in South Dakota. They were Germans, Russians, Scandinavians, Poles. And it was claimed that they voted almost solidarily against women's suffrage. But even if that was true, they must have had the assistance of 15,000 other citizens, other men. So when did suffrage pass in South Dakota? Well, the 1890 campaign that failed so miserably was followed by a series of 5 other campaigns, 1893-94, 1897-98, 1909-1910, 2013-2014, and 2015-16. In 1897, the state adopted initiative and referendum, which we still have today, and that gives citizens the right to propose legislation by petition and requires that the proposed legislation be submitted to a direct vote without action by the legislature. In other words, they can't push initiative or referendum aside. Women collected sufficient signatures to place the suffrage amendment on the ballot, only to be told by the men in charge that the initiative and referendum clause applied only to the proposal of new laws and not to constitutional amendments. Each successive suffrage campaign brought increased support, but never enough to pass. Although they had experienced defeat in 6 other campaigns, the state suffragists decided to try it again in 1916-1917. The 1917 legislature passed a resolution supporting suffrage and scheduled it for a vote of the general election in the 1918 election in November of 1918. Shortly after the legislature adjourned in 1917, the U.S. entered World War I, and the major enemy of the U.S. was Germany. After much deliberation, the suffrage leaders decided that the U.S. entry into the war was actually perfectly timed. It was not a time to retreat, it was a time to push forward. The women's contribution to the war effort strengthened their position at a time when German immigrants were accused of being alien enemies, and the liquor industry was losing ground to a growing prohibition amendment. So Governor Peter Norbeck called a special session of the legislature to discuss state affairs, in particular the German immigrant population in the state and the clause in the state's constitution that granted citizenship and property ownership to immigrants who had filed their first papers. So they could vote and they could own land, but because they were not yet naturalized, they did not have to serve in the Army. According to some press coverage of a speech by Secretary of State Frank Hood, he said, "As the law now stands, a subject of the Kaiser may come to South Dakota, reside in the state for 6 months, take out his first papers, and vote in all elections. But when war comes, he can plead that he is an immigrant and is not bound to fight for us." A woman born in South Dakota, educated in the fundamental principles of government, earnestly loyal, sacrificing so much for this world struggle, is denied the ballot, and this is not fair or just. So the section of the Constitution that dealt with immigration citizenship was the same section of the Constitution that gave men, but not women, the right to vote. So at the special session, the legislators agreed to address both issues together, immigrant citizenship and women's citizenship, and write it into the same amendment. And so in the rewriting process, the word male was eliminated from the language on suffrage, and naturalization and a 5-year residency requirement was added before immigrants could vote. So they took out the word men, naturally then including women, and they said that immigrants could not vote until they had been naturalized and they'd spent 5 years in the state. The amendment became known as the Citizenship Amendment and was promoted as part of the state's patriotic war effort. Because of the way the amendment was worded, men voting against immigrant citizenship automatically voted for women's suffrage. The amendment was popular, but it was not wildly popular. To boost support for the amendment, the Honorable William Jennings Bryan toured the state's Chautauquas during the summer of 1918 and spoke on behalf of suffrage. He also publicized the cause in his periodical called The Commoner. He wrote, "There are 2 requirements for a good voter, morality and intelligence. As the larger majority of women than men pursue their studies beyond the 8th grade, women have the more highly trained intellect. As the majority of men don't advance above the 8th grade and their teachers are generally women, all the instruction they receive about government is given to them by women. In considering the moral standpoint, in our state, in Nebraska at least, there are 98% more men in the penitentiary than there are women, and a similar proportion prevails across the U.S. And if you go to church, this percentage is almost reversed. Therefore, if women are intelligent enough to stay out of the penitentiary and in the churches, it seems they have the qualifications of good voters, regardless of gender." The suffrage amendment finally passed in South Dakota in November 1918 with a 60% majority. So 50 years and 7 formal campaigns later, the amendment made it into the state constitution. But in reality, let's be honest, the amendment passed primarily because it took the vote away from German immigrants, not because it gave it to women. But the state's passage of the Citizenship Amendment was not the final chapter in the struggle for women's suffrage in South Dakota. When Congress adopted the 19th Amendment in 1919, the South Dakota suffragists wanted the state to be one of the first to ratify. South Dakota law required that political parties hold proposal meetings in the Capitol in December preceding an election year. Governor Norbeck was reluctant to call another special session of the legislature, but he agreed with the suffragists' ratification plan, was that if the legislators would come to Pierre at their own expense, he would call a special session. Most were coming anyway for the proposal meetings, so the special session was sent for Tuesday, December 3rd, 1919 at 7 p.m. The issue was called on November 3rd in the midst of a several-day blizzard in South Dakota. One legislator rushed home to Huron from Minneapolis, told his wife to send his suitcase after him, and just caught the train to Pierre. Another used 3 vehicles getting to the train through the blizzard. The legislature wanted to ratify the amendment as quickly as possible, so it was introduced into both houses at the same time, and the first and the second readings were completed that same night. The resolution was referred to committee, and the legislature adjourned at 11:50 p.m. The session was called into order the next day at exactly 12:01 a.m., and the national amendment was ratified by a unanimous vote at 12:44 a.m. on December 4th, 1919. It was the first time that the legislature convened in the middle of the night, but the members were anxious to get home because of the weather, and trains left Pierre in both directions at 2 a.m., so they had to get their business done so they could get out of town. Despite those efforts, South Dakota was not among the first states to ratify the 19th Amendment. South Dakota was actually the 21st state. The first states to ratify were Wisconsin, and then Illinois, and then Michigan, all on June 10, 1919. Tennessee was the 36th state to ratify the amendment on August 18, 1920, which moved then the 19th Amendment into law, because at that point we only needed 36 votes. Okay? So I've got the list here if any of you have a home state and you're wondering when they got around to it. The 19th Amendment was ratified nationally on August 18th, 1920, and added to the Constitution 8 days later. It was the single largest act of enfranchisement in the history of the United States, with millions of women casting their first votes that fall. But Native Americans were not able to vote until 1924, when the Snyder Act made them U.S. citizens. Chinese immigrants were similarly barred until the repeal of the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1943. And many Black and Latinos were functionally disenfranchised for decades by poll taxes, literacy taxes, white primary laws, and other forms of voter suppression. And remember that the vote for suffrage was not just about the right to vote. It was about equality for women in all areas of life, from pay equality to educational resources, access to credit. Women continued to fight for their rights and for the equal representation in the bodies of power that represented them. The Equal Rights Amendment, which is Title IX, the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act, all of those laws descended from suffragists and from their work. The suffrage movement was not this finite, discrete thing, let's get the vote for women. It's part of a much broader story about women's roles in American society, and getting the vote was absolutely necessary first step to get all of those other things that came afterward. In fact, many historians suggest that the suffrage movement continued until at least 1965, when the Voting Rights Act was passed. The timeline for how long women in the U.S. have had political power and independence is really not as long as we tend to think that it is. In 1923, Alice Paul and Crystal Eastman, who were the founders of the American Civil Liberties Union, sat down to write what became the Equal Rights Amendment. It was built on the promises of the 19th Amendment to ensure equality for women in all aspects of the law. The equal rights legislation was introduced to Congress in 1923. It floundered. Paul rewrote it in 1943 with the text that stands pretty much as it was then today. And it says that equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. The ERA was introduced to Congress every year from 1923 until 1972, when it finally passed as the proposed 27th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Per the Constitution, an amendment has to be ratified by 3/4 of the states. And in this case now we have 50 states, so that was 38 states rather than back when there was suffrage, and that was 36. So to be ratified, it had to be approved by 3/4 of the states, in other words, 38. While some amendments are put forward without a time limit, the ERA amendment came with a 7-year deadline. In 1978, Congress extended the original May 1979 deadline to June 30, 1982. But by the end of that deadline, only 35 states had ratified. Then, on March 22nd, 2017, 45 years to the day after it was approved by Congress, Nevada became the 36th state to ratify. And on May 30th, 2018, Illinois became the 37th state, and Virginia ratified the ERA in January 15th, 2020, bringing the total finally now to 38. But in the meantime, 5 states voted to rescind or otherwise withdraw their ratification of the ERA, and that includes South Dakota. Nebraska voted against in 1973, Tennessee in 1974, Idaho in 1977, Kentucky in 1978, and South Dakota in 1979. Article V of the amendment, or excuse me, of the Constitution speaks to the state's power to ratify an amendment, but it doesn't address the power to rescind a ratification vote. Precedent suggests that rescission is not valid. For example, the official tally of states that ratified the 14th Amendment include both New Jersey and Ohio, who had voted to approve and then later voted to rescind their approval. North Carolina and South Carolina also were included in that tally, even though they originally rejected the amendment and then later voted to ratify it. In the process of approving the 14th Amendment, Congress essentially determined that both attempted withdrawals and previous rejections prior to ratification have no legal standing. Therefore, it's really unlikely that the rescissions of Idaho, Kentucky, Nebraska, South Dakota, and Tennessee, whether those are really valid. Essentially, Congress in the past has ruled that those are not. In the meantime, the Madison Amendment, or the Congressional Compensation Amendment, was passed, which, when that amendment was approved, that moved the ERA to being the 28th Amendment to the Constitution. The Madison Amendment was originally approved in 1889, and was officially ratified in 1992. No, I'm sorry, I read that wrong. The Madison Amendment was initially approved in 1789 and was later ratified in 1992, 203 years later. Nonetheless, the status of the ERA is still uncertain. In all likelihood, the ratification process will move to the courts to determine the constitutionality of the original deadline and the 3 ratifications that occurred after that deadline. ERA backers want to get the ratification deadline invalidated, while foes want not only to keep the lapsed deadline as set, and they want that the rescission votes to remain intact, but they also want to prevent Congress from retroactively eliminating the due date. So there's still a lot of discussion about what's the status of the Equal Rights Amendment. Did it pass? Didn't it pass? What's the status? The ERA was one of the few amendments that has been introduced with a timeline for ratification. Like this other one, the Madison Amendment, they ratified it 203 years later. So women's struggles for equality aren't just about what the law says. It's also about making sure that women are part of the conversation when laws are made, and they need to be in the room where it happens, as we learned in Hamilton, right? You have to be in the room where it happens if you want to have your voice heard. The first woman elected to Congress was Jeannette Rankin. She was a Republican in Montana. She won her seat in the House of Representatives in 1916. But for a long time, she was in a very small club. 10 years later, 5 elections after the 19th Amendment became law, there were just 9 women in the 531-member Congress. All of them were in the House. The first woman elected to the Senate was Hattie Carraway. She was a Democrat from Arkansas. She did not win her seat until 1932. By 1970, 50 years after the enfranchisement of women, there were still only 11 of them in the Congress. And one of those women was Shirley Chisholm, who was the first African-American member of Congress. Currently, in 2020, there are 100 women in the U.S. House of Representatives. That doesn't count the 4 female territorial delegates. That makes women 23% of the total House electorate. Of the 325 women who have served in the U.S. House over the years, 222 have been Democrats, 103 have been Republicans. Currently, there are 26 women, 17 Democrats, 9 Republicans, who serve in the U.S. Senate. Of those 26, 4 are women of color. So now, 100 years after the passage of the 19th Amendment, the vote and the fight for voting rights feels as relevant today as it ever has. Today, we're concerned about voter ID laws, about long lines at the polls, about malfunctioning voter machines, about closed polling places, and concerns about whether or not our absentee ballot will get counted. And there's a great deal of rhetoric about whether or not voter fraud will escalate with absentee voting and mail-in ballots. In fact, a couple of weeks ago, the president suggested that voters in North Carolina should vote twice in the November election, once by mail and once in person. He said, so let them send it in and let them get to vote. And if the North Carolina system is as good as they say it is, then obviously they won't be able to vote twice. If it isn't tabulated, they'll be able to vote, even though it's illegal to encourage someone to vote twice, and it's a felony to vote more than once in an election. So don't try it, okay? But you need to make sure that your vote does count. Most states allow voters to vote early by mail or in person. So know the rules and the deadlines in your state. There is an online report called How to Vote in Your State in 2020, and that has been published by the Washington Post. There's also an NBC News online report called Plan Your Vote, and that includes links to state rules. So you can check either one of those, Google them, and get the rules for your state. Understand that many states don't allow ballots to be counted until after the poll closes, so we're going to need to be patient in November. Vote early if you're using an absentee or a mail-in ballot. If you're voting by absentee ballot, make sure that you're registered and that your address is current so that you receive your ballot on time. Then request your ballot immediately, get it mailed back, or drop it off as soon as possible, at least 1 week before November 3rd. Check your registration status and the location of your polling place if you're voting in person. If you're mailing your ballot, make sure that you mail it back in plenty of time, at least 1 week, or better yet, drop it off at the auditor's office. You can do that in South Dakota. Another thing to remember is don't mess up your signature. Make sure that the signature on your request for an absentee ballot is the same as the signature on your driver's license and is the same as the signature that you put on your ballot if you're mailing it in. First name spelled out? Yes, no? Do you have a middle initial? Yes, no? Make sure that all of it matches, because that's one of the ways that your ballot can be discarded, is if the signatures don't match. Make sure everything matches. If it says to sign the back of the envelope in ink, then sign it. If it says to use blue or black ink, don't use red. Don't use a pencil. Don't use a magic marker. If it says fill in the oval, then fill it in. Don't circle it. Don't use a check mark. Vote early, but definitely don't vote often, regardless of what the president says. Suggesting that someone vote twice is illegal, and voting twice is a federal felony. Measures are in place to catch voters who try to vote twice. I called the auditor's office to ask, and we live in Minor County, and they told me that poll watchers, the people who have been signing you in as you vote in person, those in Minor County, those are the people who open the mail-in ballots, and they check the list of people who have voted in person against the mail-in ballots as they open them. In Lake County, I asked, and the poll watchers get regular calls. They don't open the mail-in ballots, but they do get regular calls throughout the day letting them know when a mail-in ballot has arrived in the office. And so they call the poll watchers, and the poll watchers then cross that person off, indicating that they have already voted. So finally, I don't know about the rest of you, but did you get a postcard from the post office this week? There are suggestions for making your vote count, or some of the things that I have mentioned. But Coloradans have indicated that the information, not on the card, but it tells you to go to a URL, usps.com/voting information. They've said that some of the information on that website is incorrect. So if I were you, I would go to the Washington Post or the New York Times, or go directly to the South Dakota Secretary of State's website. And there's a link there, and it takes you to all the information about voting. So be sure and vote early, but not often. If you're interested in learning more about suffrage, I'm sure you are. My thesis is in the DSU library. There's also a series of books called The History of Women's Suffrage. It's in the rare, they're about 20 volumes, I think. They are in the rare books archives at the SDSU library. I read the sections on South Dakota as I was working on my thesis. There are, I think, 12 plus volumes that were written by Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, and Matilda Joslyn Gage. And those books are organized by state and by year, and they do make for some wonderful reading because it's the women's actual comments post-campaign for each of those years. As a sidebar to South Dakota's suffrage history, national suffragist Matilda Joslyn Gage was one important person in South Dakota. She was the mother of 4 daughters. All of them eventually lived in South Dakota, or in Dakota Territory, at least for a time. One daughter was married to Frank Baum, who was an Aberdeen newspaperman, and Matilda Joslyn Gage lived with them for a time when she was in South Dakota working for suffrage. Her papers are archived in the Aberdeen City Library, so if you want to read about her, that's where those papers are. Frank Baum later took his family back to the East Coast, and he was living there when he wrote The Wizard of Oz. That tornado in The Wizard of Oz, yeah, you guessed it, that was a product of his imagination, having lived in the north central part of the state for a couple of years. Matilda Joslyn Gage was an enthusiastic worker for suffrage for many years, until she got into a conflict with Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. And that soured her on the movement. Eventually, she quit working for suffrage, and she devoted herself to what she referred to as the true enemy. And whenever she wrote true enemy, she put it in all capital letters. And that was the church, as far as she was concerned. She wrote a book called Woman, Church, and State, which is a truly radical perspective on the church's role in oppression for women and the impact that they had on the suffrage movement and temperance and a whole lot of things. But it's very interesting if you're interested in that kind of thing. The book is called Woman, Church, and State. And finally, I would recommend to you 2 pieces that were published recently by the New York Times in August. One is called Suffrage at 100. It's a visual tour, and it's a series of photos with commentary. It's very interesting reading. And then they also published an accompanying piece called A Century of Suffrage. And that's a much longer article, but it's also very interesting. It gives a lot of the details about suffrage at the national movement. So that's what I have for you tonight. And does anybody have any questions for me? Are we time-wise? We've got a few minutes. Oh.
I think you should poll the people in attendance to see if women have the right to vote in their church today.
Oh, okay. The question is, do women have the right to vote in your church today? Yes? Don't know. Well, when Norman grew up in a little country church outside of Howard, and when did women get the right to vote in the church?
It was in the 50s.
In the 50s. So, women.
I've been told women do still not have the right to vote.
That's the German Lutheran Church, St. John. So, Matilda Joslyn Gage, Women, Church, and State.
When you were looking at South Dakota in the first, was there kind of the east-west split that we see now, or was it was almost everybody against it?
Initially, everyone was against it. There were some that were more vocal about it than others. But there was not one newspaper in the state. And I read 10 newspapers from, I think, about September through the election, in those 10 newspapers in all of the campaigns. And the first 2 campaigns, really, there was not one positive thing. And you could tell that from the comments of the newspapermen. They made fun of it. It was a source of amusement, if nothing else. And as the campaigns wore on, they eventually became a little more positive. Frank Baum was one of the newspapermen. I read his newspaper, and he was one of the people who was supportive. Eventually, I'm sure his mother-in-law got a hold of his ear, and twisted a little bit, but he was very pro-suffrage. And eventually, probably about 2/3 of the way through the last several campaigns, more and more newspapers were positive. But remember, there was still, in those middle years, there was all those immigrants who were voting, and they were very strict authoritarians in their home. And there was the liquor industry was very prominent in putting down the vote, and in fact, rumored to be outside the polling places before and after, handing out drinks. What's that?
Those were the days.
Those were the days, that's right. Newspapers, if you read some of those old newspapers, they don't use headlines like we do today. you know. So you literally are reading, trying to find the news. But by the last campaign, by 1918, there was so much outrage about Germany and the German immigrants having the right to vote that they started using cartoons in the newspapers, and the headlines started getting bigger. But they would have, I've got photocopies, I think, in my thesis, of some of the cartoons that were in the newspaper, and it was a caricature of the Kaiser, the German Kaiser, and there was a box that said vote, and his hand is stuck down in the in the slot where you would stick your ballot. His hand is down in there, and so the rising sentiment against Germans was really what got the suffrage movement passed. I mean, that was without a question. And I always thought, I remember one of the questions that I got asked when I defended my thesis, and one of the women on my board, that's not the right word, committee. One of the women said, well, what do you think about the ERA? Because this was kind of in the middle, when all of the hoo-ha about the ERA was being talked about. And I said then that I thought the ERA would pass much like suffrage did when something else came forward and made the ERA much less radical. So it hasn't happened. But I think that might be the answer for the ERA also, is there's got to be some other movement that just disgusts everybody in the US so much, there's some other action that pushes the ERA to the forefront, and we say, yes, we really do need this.
Yeah, you've talked a lot about voting, which I appreciate, not just women voting, but all of us voting in November. One of the largest self-disenfranchised groups you no doubt know is, look around the room, college students, young adults. You're an educator, we're educators. What can we do to get this group more involved?
Well, one thing we did, I'm part of AAUW, and every fall at the Fall Fest, or whatever it's called now, we always have a registration booth. And we take applications for ballots, and we take applications for absentee ballots in South Dakota. So that's one of the things I think as educators we need to do, is provide that opportunity. And we didn't just sit behind our table. We kind of went out and said, are you registered? Are you registered? Are you registered? I mean, we're kind of proactive. Yeah, and I'm handing out stamps to put on your absentee ballot. But I think that we don't have civic classes anymore. I mean, civics is not a topic that gets taught in college, or maybe even very much in high school. But I do think it should be part of our conversation. And I think things like this, supporting the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, is another way to make people more aware of it. And you go home tonight and you say, oh, I heard kind of an interesting conversation tonight about the national movement to give women the right to vote. And then you talk to your 12-year-old or your 14-year-old or your 16-year-old or whatever it might be, and say, don't forget, you need to do this. If you've got college-age kids, you should be sending them a note saying, do you need an absentee ballot, or are you coming home? Those are your choices. So, I don't know. Education. I have a t-shirt that says education is the answer to every problem. So, I hope that's true. I don't know. Anybody else? Questions? I don't know if they can.
How many are online overall? Not right now.
No, I didn't think you
We'll
could.
tell you later.
Mention it in your classes. They can go to, I think, when we collected the request, the registration, we had to take them to the auditor's office immediately after it was filled out. So I don't know that anybody kept any forms, but they can go to the local auditor's office and pick up a form, both to register to vote and to request an absentee ballot if they're in South Dakota. Otherwise, their mom would, their parents would have to send it to them, probably. They can go online. We also gave them the addresses for, was it Iowa, South, Minnesota, Nebraska?
It's basically just your state
Secretary of State.
Yeah.
If you search that in Google, you're gonna get there.
And so you can fill out, you don't have to fill it out in front of you. You can do it electronically to register to vote. So, okay? Is that it? Thanks so much for coming. Oh.
Thanks, everybody.
How to address it. Killed my children's struggle. Go tomorrow. Right. Stuff it.
That was